Previously on Conspiracy in Canton.
Boston police officer John O'Keefe was found face up in the snow on Saturday morning
outside a home currently occupied by people known to O'Keefe.
The body of a fellow Boston police officer is dead in your yard, and nobody from inside the house even comes outside.
State prosecutors accuse Karen Reed, who was O'Keefe's girlfriend, of backing into him and leaving him to die in the snow.
It's impossible to report on this without acknowledging the bitter debates from both sides.
Prosecutors point to pieces of a broken taillight. Her lawyers argue the police report was altered. Pieces of her taillight weren't found until after her car was taken into custody.
First got to that scene at 6 a.m. and did not find a single piece of taillight. And then 12 hours later, boom, they found taillight everywhere.
I don't think there's any kind of conspiracy or anything like that.
Lawyers for the woman under arrest not only say their client is innocent, but they're alleging a cover-up.
Anytime there's a cover-up, there's always someone involved who has two things. One is powerful connections, and number two, something to hide.
The lead detective is very close with the owners of that property.
The Alberts also have connections to the Attorney General's office, to a firefighter that was on scene, and even to the judge.
They say there were a lot of people at the home that night, and one of them Googled how long to die in the cold hours before Reed would have known O'Keefe was missing.
With every new detail comes a new controversy, and nothing is what it seems on the surface. Even if the theory of how John died is not correct, that part to me right now doesn't even matter. What matters to me is that they are lying. They are lying on court documents. They are lying to the public. And that is the part that should scare the shit out of everybody in Massachusetts. That's preventing justice.
Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed!
If you missed episode 1 of Conspiracy in Canton, I recommend stopping here and going back to listen to that one first. This is a complicated case, and there are a lot of people involved, a lot of information, and a lot of discrepancies in information. On episode 1, I introduced the controversial case of Karen Reed and went over some of the main points that originally grabbed my attention. For example, the arguments over the broken taillight, the Google searches and deleted calls, and how the injuries that John sustained could be due to a 3-point turn, but the only significant damage to the car was a broken taillight. I started to question everything, and the first thing I do when I'm trying to get answers is go to the public documents. I always say that the devil is in the details, and I have a process that I use when I'm starting out on a new case. I like to take the court documents, everything with official timestamps, data, all the information that I can find, and I compile it into one spreadsheet in a timeline. People can misremember things or get details mixed up or just flat out lie, but data doesn't lie. I compile everything into one timeline, and I use this as my base. These are the things that we know without a doubt happened at these times. Or did they? Normally, when I pull up things like the probable cause affidavit or the indictment or even the bond papers, there's some sort of cohesive story that they tell, each falling into place in a way that helps create the story of what happened in my mind so that I can better visualize it. This, however, not one of those cases. Instead of using the official information from the court documents to fill any gaps and help create a full picture, all it did was create more questions. In this episode, we are going to take a look at the first few months of the investigation based on documents from law enforcement, the district attorney, video surveillance, and reports summarizing witness interviews and statements. I think you'll be surprised at some of what we find, but we have a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. In order to start building our timeline, I'm going to just focus today on the initial statements and reports that were used in the investigation during those first few weeks. I want to take a look at what was said, what wasn't said, what stayed consistent, and what changed. Human recollection is flawed by nature, especially when there's alcohol and/or trauma involved. I want to take a look at what the people that were involved had to say about this night, the original stories and memories before they had subpoenaed cell records or verified timestamps for these events. Like all investigations, the first responders to the crime scene are the first to begin gathering information. In a Canton Police Department incident report dated January 30th, 2022, there are statements from reporting officer Sergeant Sean Good, patrolman Steve Seraph, Stephen Mullaney, and Michael Lank. Now, there's also an altered police report that was filed in October of 2022, but we will get into that more later. The rest of the dates are confusing for two reasons. One, because during the entire first 21 months of this investigation, Massachusetts State Police have not recorded one single interview. In fact, it wasn't until last month when they interviewed Lucky, the snowplow driver, that they finally recorded an interview. Mind you, this was the first time the lead investigators even spoke to Lucky, the snowplow driver who drove his route up and down Fairview Road right in front of the Alberts house where a dead body was supposedly lying out in the snow all night. Plow drivers have to pay attention to their surroundings. They sit in a high truck with good lighting, and they have to be alert. If your investigation centers around a dead body being left in the yard all night, wouldn't Lucky have been one of the very first people you would want to speak to? Lucky has met with private investigators for Karen Reed's defense team. He's met with FBI, and he has even done a phone interview with journalist and blogger Aiden Carney, or Turtle Boy, but not once had state police talked to him until last month. That is a huge concern. But aside from not having recorded interviews, the reports that memorialize what was said in the interviews that were conducted are often dated much later than the actual interview. These are generally recorded for a reason. You don't know what details might matter in an investigation. Something that seems insignificant now might just be the detail that cracks a case wide open. This is also concerning because some of the details that are mentioned in these reports of these interviews, they change with different reports. How are we supposed to know if that's the witness or the investigator who's responsible for the discrepancies if there's no record of what was actually said? We're going to look at a few more statements and reports of interviews, but again, without them being recorded, we're kind of just going by whatever is presented to us and having to accept it as fact. There's an interview with Jen McCabe from February 1st of 2022 from Trooper Kathleen Prince and Connor Keefe. There's an interview from February 3rd of Nicole Albert, though that report isn't dated until almost 3 weeks later, February 23rd. There's an interview from Ryan Nagel on February 7th. There's an interview with Lucky, the snowplow driver, which, by the way, is not, like I said, a police interview, but this is actually an interview from the private investigator hired by Karen Reed's defense team. Julie and Chris Albert interviewed on February 10th, and the report was dated February 21st. There's also an interview from January 29th of Jen McCabe, hours after the incident, but the report on that one wasn't done and turned in until April 6th. Brian Albert also did an interview on January 29th, and that report wasn't sent in until April 7th. And the January 29th interview of Matt McCabe, that report also wasn't dated until April 7th and turned in by Proctor. These interviews and reports are what were used to come up with the probable cause affidavit, or PCA, as you'll hear me refer to it, which is basically giving the probable cause and the reason why they believe that Karen Reed should be arrested. There were also some other reports and information that were gathered for the PCA, like video surveillance or phone records. When we get to those things, I will specify those, but for this specific timeline, we're not going to dig into all of those yet, and there's a reason for that, but we'll get to that later. The other document that these are used for to create was the Statement of Case that was signed June of 2022 from the District Attorney's Office, Michael Morrissey, and it was signed by Adam C. Lally, the Assistant DA. So let's break all of this down. There will be a lot of names mentioned, so if you need to check out the cheat sheet graphic on who's who, you can pull it up at 13thjurorpodcast.com. Now, aside from the law enforcement statements, We have the lead investigators, Proctor and Buchanan, and Assistant DA Lally. As for those involved, I'll give you a quick reminder from episode 1. Brian and Nicole Albert are the homeowners at Fairview, and Brian is a Boston cop, just like John. Nicole's sister is Jen McCabe, whose name comes up a lot, and her husband is Matt McCabe. Homeowner Boston cop Brian has a few brothers, including pizza shop owner and select board member Chris Albert, who was there with his wife Julie. Their son is Colin, the high school senior and football star that I mentioned in episode 1. We will also hear about homeowner Boston cop Brian's son, Brian Jr., because this happened to be his birthday and he had a few friends over. And we'll hear about their daughter Caitlin, who's an investigator for the Attorney General's office, and her boyfriend Tristan. Got it? Good. Let's dig in. According to the interviews, homeowner Nicole Albert said that she didn't really know Karen. She said she had never really met her. She knew John, but had only met him once or twice in social settings. She was aware that John had recently moved near her sister, Jen McCabe, and knew him basically just as Kaylee's uncle. She didn't know, according to her interview, that Jen had invited John and Karen to her house, and she said she didn't hear any noises. Nicole's husband, Boston cop Brian, also said that he didn't know that John and Karen were coming to his house. They were invited by Jen McCabe. He said he was fine with it. They would be welcome if they came, but he just wasn't aware of it. Nicole's sister, Jen McCabe, says that she knows John because of her daughter and John's niece, Kaylee, being friends. She said that John had also encouraged her and Karen to become friends because they both suffer from multiple sclerosis. Jen's husband, Matt McCabe, said that he's known John for about 8 years. Selectman Chris Albert and his wife Julie did an interview together on February 10th, and according to their interview, they've known John for about 4 or 5 years, but have only met Karen once. Julie actually said that she did not consider Karen a friend. Karen was not her friend, only an acquaintance, and John was her friend. Kind of a strange thing for a report, but something I noted. So, Selectman Chris and his wife Julie, in their February 10th interview report, state that John went into D&E Pizza with his adopted son, Patrick, who, if you remember, is also his nephew. Now, he told Chris that he had plans to go later to CF McCarthy's or to Waterfall, sometime later in the evening. The first mention of the timeline starts about 7:30 p.m. So homeowner Nicole Albert's statement says that she went to meet her sister Julie, her daughter Tristan, and her daughter's boyfriend out at dinner at Waterfall at 7:30. So here's the problem. Her sister is not Julie. Julie is her sister-in-law. And her daughter is not Tristan. Her daughter is Caitlin. And Caitlin's boyfriend is Tristan. So we're already off to a pretty rough start on statements. There's also another discrepancy here, and I'm going to skip ahead only because I think that this is really important. If we ignore all of the errors on this report, we can assume that Nicole showed up at Waterfall to meet her sister-in-law Julie and her daughter Caitlin and Caitlin's boyfriend Tristan. This is at 7:30 to have dinner. But if we skip ahead to her husband's statement, Brian, he says that at 10 p.m., he and his wife Nicole arrived at Waterfall to meet friends. So at 7:37, John is seen on video surveillance walking into CF McCarthy's with his friend Michael. CF McCarthy and Waterfall are really close. So at this point, Julie is texting John, telling him that they're at Waterfall to get down there. She sends him that text about 8:45, and it's only about 5 minutes later that Karen walks into CF McCarthy's and meets John. It's about 9 o'clock now, and there's more people gathering at Waterfall as well. Jen and Matt McCabe show up at Waterfall to meet the Alberts, and so do their friends Nicholas and Karina, who arrive after their daughter's basketball game. Meanwhile, Karen is seen on video surveillance at CF McCarthy's going to the bartender to get a drink. Now, the video footage shows her getting a clear drink with a lime, and she gets a total of 7 drinks while she's here. Some of them are in a shot glass, some of them are in a cylinder-type glass, but she gets a total of 7 while she's at C.F. McCarthy's during that 2-hour period. At 10 o'clock, Brian Albert arrives at Waterfall. According to his wife Nicole's report, he had just returned from New York City and he came to meet everybody there. Remember that on his statement, it says that he arrived there at 10 p.m. with his wife Nicole. Unfortunately, because the investigators don't record any of these interviews, we don't know if this is his mistake or if it's a mistake by the interviewers. According to video surveillance, Karen is seen leaving C.F. McCarthy's at 10:40 p.m. with a glass in her right hand. According to the interview with Selectman Chris and his wife Julie, Julie said that she sent the last text to John at 10:41, and shortly after that, John and Karen walked into Waterfall. Video surveillance shows them walking in at 10:54 p.m., and Karen has a drink in her right hand. Jen McCabe and Julie Albert both noted in their statements that they saw her walk in with that glass. Karen actually sat down and talked to law enforcement when she was at her parents' house, and they came later in the day on the 29th. Now, when they asked her about this, she said that she did not have a drink in her right hand. Now, I want to point something out here. According to video surveillance, Karen was wrong. She did have a glass in her hand. And another thing, she had more drinks, according to the video surveillance, than she remembers having or that she said she has. The reason I think this is important is because it's during the same interview at her parents' house where she supposedly tells investigators that when she dropped John off, she did a 3-point turn and then left to go home. She's the only one who initially said anything about doing a 3-point turn. So I want to point out that she's wrong here because I think that her level of intoxication, maybe the others didn't quite understand it because they all said that she didn't seem like she was drunk or buzzed. But I think it's possible that she was more intoxicated than they realized. The statement from Karina, while they were hanging out at Waterfall Bar, says that she remembers Karen, quote, pushing quite a bit, end quote, for Selectman Chris, who owns the pizza shop across the street, to go across the street after leaving the bar to keep partying while he made pies for everyone. She also said that Karen complained about John's mom and lack of private time that the couple had for vacations because of the kids, their activities, and responsibilities. All of the interviews conducted basically said that there was no fighting or arguing, there were no tensions, nothing seemed off while they were at Waterfall. They also all agreed that there were no visible signs that Karen or John were overly intoxicated while they were out. It was around midnight when everybody got ready to leave Waterfall. About 10 minutes after midnight, Karen can be seen on video surveillance walking out of Waterfall with 2 females, and moments later, John walks out right behind her with a glass in his right hand. The video shows that it had just begun snowing and there's a light layer of snow starting to gather on everything. As the night's winding down, Matt McCabe says that he went to go speak with the band as everyone else was leaving the bar. He says that John and Karen left before he did. The only ones left inside the bar were 4 band members and himself. According to the report on Brian Albert's interview and the statement of case, Brian says that he did not know that John and Karen were coming to his house, that they were invited by Jen McCabe. Brian and Nicole were unaware that John and Karen planned on coming over, although they had no issue with them coming over. In the report of Jen McCabe's interview from February 1st, she says that she asked Karen and John if they wanted to come back to Brian Albert's for Brian Jr.'s birthday. But the report for her January 29th interview says that as the band was cleaning, Brian Albert is the one who invited everybody back to his house. In Sergeant Lank's report, he says that Brian and Nicole stated that they both recalled that John had been welcomed to come to their home, but never arrived. So now in this report, they recall him being invited, but before they didn't know. There are also conflicting accounts about who was actually present at the house, and that one continues to progress as time goes on. But just looking at these initial interviews, in Sergeant Lank's interview, Brian and Nicole told Sergeant Lank that the others present at some point in the house that night consisted of Brian Albert Jr., Caitlin Albert, Julie Nagel, who was a friend of Brian Albert Jr.'s, and Brian Higgins. Brian Higgins is a friend of Boston cop Brian Albert, and he's also a member of ATF and has an office at the Canton Police Department. Sergeant Lank's report also says that Caitlin had been at the house, but left around 12:15 a.m. when she was picked up by her boyfriend, Tristan Morris. Now, this is interesting because, if you'll remember, Caitlin and Tristan were said in the report before to have been at Waterfall with everybody. So if this couple is together at Waterfall already, why would he need to pick her up from the house and leave at 12:15? Sergeant Lank's interview left off some other people, though. In Chris and Julie Albert's interview from February 10th, they said that they were present at Waterfall and then followed to Brian's house in the early morning hours. There are also other names that come up later. There are slight discrepancies on times of texts that were sent throughout the next half hour, but we know that as everyone was leaving Waterfall to head to Boston cop Brian and Nicole's house, John O'Keefe called and texted Jen McCabe for the address and directions. At this point, Brian Albert Jr., who's celebrating his birthday today, has a couple of friends over. One of those friends, Julie Nagel, has called her brother, Ryan, to come pick her up and give her a ride home. Ryan goes with his friend Richie, driving a gray Ford F-150, with Ryan in the front passenger seat, Richie driving, and Ryan's girlfriend Heather in the back passenger seat. Now, Ryan is only going to pick up his sister, or so he thinks. She ends up coming out and talking to them for a moment, invites the three of them to come inside. They decline, but she tells them that she wants to stay and hang out and will probably just end up spending the night. But Ryan is only there for his sister Julie. He doesn't have ties to the Alberts or McCabes. He's just doing a favor for his sister. So I want to go over his statement first. Ryan says that as they approach Fairview Road, the headlights of a midsize black SUV come from the opposite direction on Cedar Crest. So they yield to the SUV that then turns right onto Fairview, and Ryan says that they make a left onto Fairview behind them. Richie stops the truck in front of the house. The black SUV stops along the curb in front of them, toward the left side of the property as you look at the home from the street. He says that they were out there for no longer than 5 minutes. Julie had decided she wanted to stay. They looked up. They saw the SUV had moved up some, the position now along the edge of the property. And he says that it looks like it wasn't in park because the rear brake lights were illuminated and the car was near the flagpole. Ryan says that they drove on past the SUV, the interior light was on, and a Caucasian female was seated inside holding the steering wheel at a 10-2 position. Ryan says she was looking ahead, and he did not see anybody else inside the car. He also didn't see the SUV leave and didn't see any damage to it. Ryan said that it had started snowing about half an hour before that, so there was just a light coat of snow on the ground. Now here's the part where so many statements are conflicting. Let's start with Jen McCabe. There are multiple statements where she says that while inside, she observed a black SUV arrive from the front door. But she's also got a conflicting statement where she says that someone told her that there's a car outside, so that's when she looked out and saw a car in front of the house. She has multiple statements where she says that when she saw the SUV, she assumed that it was John and Karen, so she sent John text messages and said, "Hey," or "pull in behind me," or whatever that statement was. But there are multiple ones saying that she saw it and assumed it was them. However, there's also a statement saying that she saw the passenger door open, but they never came in. There's only one statement where she says that, and it was the Sergeant Good narrative that was in the police report. It's the only time she said it, and it was never brought up again. There's also in the statement to Mulaney a time when she says that John and Karen were invited but never arrived, but Karen dropped John off sometime between midnight and 1 a.m. Now, how would she say that he was dropped off if she keeps saying that he never made it in the house? So 5 of the reports say that she saw it arrive. One says that someone else saw it arrive, pointed it out, and then she went to look and it was already there. So let's just assume that one of those was somehow transcribed wrong. She saw the car arrive. Well, we have Ryan Nagel's statement saying that he pulled up about the same time as John and Karen, and he pulled up in the center of the yard right past the driveway. Karen and John pulled up toward the left side of the property. So if she's looking out the window and she sees this car, how does she not also see a truck, since the truck is the one that was actually in front of the house and the SUV was past the house toward the edge of the property? How are 2 vehicles parked in front of your house and that's not included in any of your reports? Especially since the whole theory is that this was a hit and run. And what about the other inconsistencies? In Sergeant Good's report, he says that Jen claimed she saw the passenger door open, but they never came in the house, and then she saw the car drive off. Why is that never mentioned again in any other reports? And if she saw the car drive off, how did she not see a body laying in the snow right beside it? All 3 reports on Matt McCabe's statements say that he observed the SUV pull up on the street. 2 of them say that the SUV pulled up in front of the house. One of them says that the SUV pulled up towards the edge of the property. But again, none of his statements mention that F-150. According to the PCA, Jen texted John hello at 12:31 a.m. Her January 29th report says that the SUV was parked on the street by the entrance of the driveway. She saw the SUV, so she texted John, hello, pull up behind me at 12:31. Now, again, this is the location where the truck was parked, not the SUV. There are also multiple statements about the car moving positions while it's parked in front of the house. Reports say that Matt McCabe looked out the window and observed that the same vehicle had moved toward the edge of the property. The PCA clarifies that this is the left side of the property where the flagpole and the trees are. The PCA, the statement of case, and the report on Jen McCabe's January 29th interview all state that she observed the SUV travel along the road toward the left side of the property where John was discovered. However, Jen McCabe's February 1st interview statement says that she looked out the window a little while later and the car had moved to the left. Again, conflicting statements. During this time, there are texts from Jen to John saying hello and to pull up behind her car in the driveway and asking, where are you? And there are also calls that are unanswered. And Jen says that she believes that her phone accidentally called John while she was trying to put it in her pocket. So what about the car leaving? Pretty much all of Jen McCabe's statements say that she observed that SUV drive away. Now, if you observed the SUV drive away, how would you see that but not see John's body on the ground? Also, according to Matt McCabe, he observed the vehicle drive off down Fairview in the same direction it had been facing while it was parked. So that would mean Karen never did a 3-point turn. There is a statement from the report on Matt McCabe's interview from January 29th that says that he saw tire tracks consistent with a 3-point turn, but he says that he didn't see them before the SUV got there. But seeing tire tracks in a spot where the car was, but you can't see a body, that doesn't make sense. And also, he's the one who said he saw the car drive off in the same direction it had been facing. Now, according to the PCA, Karen says that she dropped John off and went home to his house since she was having stomach issues at the previous bar. Karen stated that as she dropped the victim off, she made a 3-point turn in the street and left, and she said that she did not see him enter the house. But it was this same interview that's documented in the PCA where she also said that she didn't leave the C.F. McCarthy's bar with a drink in her right hand and that she didn't enter into Waterfall with that same drink in her hand. She was wrong about that. So who's to say she's not wrong about the 3-point turn? Look, Karen had a lot of drinks that night, and she's a small woman. She had no business being behind the wheel. There's evidence that points toward her being guilty of driving under the influence, but is there evidence that points toward her being responsible for John O'Keefe's death? In Sergeant Good's report, he also states that Karen was yelling, "Is he dead?" when they showed up at the scene, and that when he asked her about if she drove there last night, she said, quote, "I think so," end quote, and then after that responded with, "I can't remember." He stopped questioning her because she was too upset and unable to keep her train of thought. If she can't remember, and this isn't the only statement that she made about not remembering if she went there or not, but if she can't remember, then we can't really rely on her recollection of what happened that night. So we have to look at the actual evidence. Is Karen being framed to take the fall for something else that happened because she was too intoxicated to actually remember details? Or is evidence going to support the state's theory that she backed into John and did a 3-point turn, ran over him, and left him there to die? At this point, Karen has gone home. She's now at John's house and goes to sleep, although she does try to call and text John multiple times and he doesn't respond. Let's look at the statements about people leaving the Alberts' home. Homeowner Nicole Albert says that all guests had left her home by 1 a.m. According to Sergeant Lank's report, Jen McCabe said that she and Matt left at 1:30 a.m. and gave a ride home to Julie Nagel on Highland Street in Canton. According to Jen McCabe's report on her February 1st interview, however, she says that they drove 2 of her nephew's friends home, and then they went home. On the report for the January 29th interview, it doesn't say anything about taking anybody home. It just says that they left the residence approximately 1:30 a.m. and went home. Something else to note, just another error. On the report for the February 1st interview, the report says that Jen and Matt were at the house from around 11:45 a.m. until 1:45 a.m. And I don't know if this is supposed to mean 11:45 p.m., but they didn't even leave the bar until after midnight, so this report is just wrong. Also, 1:30 a.m. isn't the correct time. It was closer to 1:47 according to data. The reports don't mention any of the other guests leaving, but there is grand jury testimony that mentions Brian Higgins leaving to go to do administrative work at Canton Police Office at 1:30 a.m. Now, I mentioned that in the first episode, and that's something that we're going to get into more later. It's not in these reports, so I'm not bringing it up too in-depth here, but I want to make a note of that because it is going to be important later on. Jen and Matt McCabe arrived back home after 2 a.m. According to her phone location data, it shows it was around 2:12. Now, this is about the same time that Lucky, the plow driver, is leaving the yard alone to go plow his route. It's during this time that Jen has the search on her phone, "How long to die in the cold?" That's at 2:27 a.m. and 40 seconds. It's around this same time that the plow driver, Lucky, says in his interview that he witnessed a Ford Edge parked outside of Fairview Road, right where John's body was found. He says he didn't notice footprints and the car wasn't running, but it was there for a significant amount of time, for at least an hour into the storm. He didn't see any tracks or footprints anywhere near it, and he says he doesn't know the color of the Ford Edge because he's colorblind, but he thinks that it was tan, which means maybe he thinks it was light colored. But he said the Ford Edge was not accumulating snow on top of it like it had been there for a while. He said maybe an inch or two, if that. Lucky also says in the interview, he did not see a dead body. There was no body anywhere near that yard when he was plowing those roads. Even when that car wasn't there and he had a completely clear view, there was no body there. And he said that the way that he sits, he definitely would have seen it. This is huge. If the entire Commonwealth case rests on the fact that Karen did a 3-point turn, hit John, left him for dead, and his body was laying out in the cold until she arrived back at 6 a.m., well, now we have statements saying that she didn't do a 3-point turn and a witness that says there was no dead body, plus the witnesses from the house who all left during this time when his body would have been out there, and witnesses that were able to see that there were tire tracks right there, but weren't able to see a human body laying there. All of the evidence at this point from all of the statements goes absolutely against what their theory is. So then how did we get from this to Karen Reed being arrested and charged with manslaughter and eventually murder? Well, one key factor is that, like I said, law enforcement didn't bother talking to Lucky until last month. This entire time, 21 months has gone by, and the one witness who was right there back and forth across that street the entire night and early into the morning, they never spoke to. The other piece of evidence that they say links Karen to John's death is the taillight, and we're about to get into some of that. Karen had gone home to John's house and gone to sleep. His niece was still at the house, although his nephew, Patrick, had gone to spend the night somewhere else. At about 4:30 a.m., according to the statement of case, Karen woke up John's niece because she was hysterical and screaming and frantic. Reports say that it was 4:53 a.m. when Jen received a call from Kaylee and Karen looking for John. Now, there's a few different stories here, and I think that the alcohol consumption that we talked about earlier can probably account for some of it. According to the statement of case, John's niece says that Karen changed her story several times while speaking to Jen on the phone. And initially, Karen was saying that she and John had gotten into an argument and she dropped him off. According to Jen McCabe's January 29th interview report, Jen says that she got the call from Kaylee and Karen was saying that John didn't come home and says that she last saw him at Waterfall. And she tells Karen that she and John left Waterfall together and went to Fairview Road. Jen McCabe's February 1st interview report also says that she got the call from Kaylee and Karen wanted to talk to her because she says that she left John at Waterfall. The report of Jen's interview says that they made some calls to some different friends of John's, thinking that maybe he went over there. So they called Tom Betty and they called Carrie Roberts. At this point, Karen is still hysterical, and she gets in the car and she drives to Jen's house. Now, in all the different statements from Jen McCabe, not once does it say anything about Karen telling her that she got into a fight with John the last time she had seen him. The only time that that's mentioned is in the statement of case, and it's said as a part of John's niece's statement, not anything that Jen McCabe had said. But according to the statement of case, defendant informed Jen that she and John got into an argument the last time she had seen him. I think it's important to note that here because if that's not in any of the statements that Jen McCabe made before and it's not documented on any of those, I think it's really important that it's all of a sudden in court documents here. Now, this call from Karen to Jen is at 4:53 a.m. At 4:55 a.m., according to the interview with Chris and Julie Albert, Julie said that she was asleep when her phone rang and it woke her up and it was Jen's missed call. And that call was how she found out about John dying. But here's the problem. That was at 4:55 a.m. That was an hour before they actually found John's body. So how would she have known that he's dying at that point? At that point, all they know is that he didn't come home. There's also yet another discrepancy on the reports here. Reports say that Katie McLaughlin says that approximately 5 a.m., Canton Fire and EMS were dispatched to 34 Fairview Road. But it wasn't 5 a.m. The 911 call didn't even come in until 6:04 a.m. So, yet again, another problem. There's something else that I want to point out right here. According to the PCA, Carrie told 2 troopers in a January 29th interview at 5:25 p.m. that she got a call from Karen stating that John didn't come home. It was snowing. She was worried. However, according to Proctor's phone interview on February 1st, he says that Carrie answered the phone and heard Karen state that John's dead. Carrie, I wonder if he's dead. It's snowing. He got hit by a plow. Now, those are 2 totally different phone calls. So the very first interview doesn't say anything about John being dead or getting hit by a plow. All it says is that she was concerned because he didn't come home and it was snowing. When Proctor gives his report on what was said, now all of a sudden she's saying that she thinks that he's dead and he got hit by a plow. We know that about this time, Carrie heads over to Jen McCabe's house, which is also where Karen is heading. When they get to Jen's, Karen is too hysterical to drive, so Jen drives her car back to John's house, and Carrie follows them in her car. When they get back to John's, they apparently look inside to see if John is there, and then they leave to go look for him. Now, here's a couple things about this as well. In Sergeant Good and Sergeant Lank's interviews, they talked to Carrie and said that she had gone to pick Jen and Karen up, but they didn't say anything about going to Jen's house first. On the PCA, that first interview that Carrie did on January 29th at 5:25 with the 2 troopers, she says that she met Karen at Jen McCabe's house, and she says that she followed them to John's. But Jen McCabe, on her January 29th interview, says that Carrie Roberts met her and Karen at John's house. Carrie also said that when she met them at Jen McCabe's house, she observed Karen to be hysterical, and she believed that she was possibly still intoxicated. She said that Karen had even told her that she doesn't remember the night before, and she told Jen, "I was so drunk, I don't remember going to your sister's last night." But here's what's most important about this part to me. Jen said that she drove Karen's SUV from her house back to John's because Karen was too hysterical, and Carrie Roberts followed them. Carrie said that she followed Karen's black SUV back to John's, and she says it was whiteout conditions. Now, anyone who's ever driven in a snowstorm or a rainstorm, if you're trying to follow somebody and it's hard to see and visibility is that bad, what's the thing that you look at? You look at their taillights. You follow their taillights. So if she followed them from Jen McCabe's house back to John's house and the weather conditions were so bad and she was following them, how would she not have noticed if the taillight was shattered? According to the reports done for Jen McCabe's interviews from January 29th and February 1st, and it was also added to the statement of case and the PCA, Jen says that Karen told her, "Could I have hit him? Did I hit him?" and brought it up multiple times when they were in this car ride on the way back to John's house from Jen McCabe's. But Jen McCabe also gave her statement to multiple officers on the scene, and not one of them have any report of her telling them that Karen thought that she had hit John. In fact, it wasn't until after officers left that Jen McCabe actually called Sergeant Lank back and asked him to come back to Fairview Road and speak to her. He said that they went immediately back, and that's when she tells them that she recalled something that she wasn't sure if they were aware of. She says that when Karen was driving around with her and Carrie, that she kept saying something to the effect of, "I hope I didn't hit him." And Jen said that she made statements, again, at the crime scene where the victim was discovered. But why would that be the first time she mentions this? That seems like a huge thing to bring up. And this is the first time that she says it, and it's not even while they're on the scene. She calls them to come back to talk to her. Something else to note here. Of the 4 other responders who were some of the first on the scene that took statements from Jen McCabe, not only did she not mention it to any of them, but all of them have it in their reports that they heard Karen hysterical and upset, and she kept saying, "Is he dead? Is he dead?" They were all around her enough to hear her repeating this over and over, but not one of them said that she said anything about, "Did I hit him?" As a matter of fact, the only responder who mentions that she heard Karen say, "Did I hit him?" was Katie McLaughlin, who did an interview with Buchanan and Proctor. There are already questions about Proctor being involved as the lead investigator for this case because he has close connections to the Alberts and the McCabes. But Katie does too. Remember Caitlin that we talked about? Brian and Nicole's daughter? She and Katie are friends. Pretty close friends, actually. So how is it that she's the only one who heard that when none of the other first responders on the scene who gave statements heard anything like that? But that's not all. Let's talk about the cracked taillight. There's video showing Karen pulling out of John's garage, and she backs into his car. Now, it's important to note that there are reports that they did go and check John's car and there was no damage done. But in the video, which I encourage you to look at when you get a chance, you can see her back into it slightly. Now, the report from the Commonwealth says that she came very close to it, but her defense attorneys are saying, no, if you zoom in, you can see that she actually hits the car. Also, pay attention to the snow that's on the bumper. Maybe that'll help you make up your mind. It's snowing, but you can see Karen pulling out of the driveway, and even though it's snowing, it still has enough visibility with the camera for you to be able to see the taillights. You can see clearly that the right taillight is still in place. The visibility is not enough to where you can tell if it's cracked or not, but you can definitely see that it's not shattered and missing a bunch of pieces. Now, according to Jen McCabe's February 1st interview report, she says that Karen told her, "Look at the crack in my taillight. There's a crack in it." And Jen said that she did notice damage to the taillight. In that January 29th interview report that was filed in April, there was some stuff added in. All of a sudden, now the story is that once Karen, Jen, and Carrie arrived at John's, that they looked at the, quote, broken taillight together. It went from being cracked to being broken. I know this might sound like a small detail, but I want to point it out because it keeps going. Jen stated that she observed the broken/cracked right taillight to Karen's SUV, according to that report. Now remember, that report, even though it's dated January 29th for the interview, was not actually filed and sent until April. The PCA has the word cracked when explaining the taillight. But in June, the statement of case now has escalated this, and instead of it being a cracked taillight, the statement says, once at John's, Karen and Jen looked at a cracked taillight. The right rear taillight is cracked and missing pieces. Missing pieces was added to the statement of case and is not in any report anywhere else up to that point. You can see in that video when she's leaving John's driveway that taillight is not missing pieces. And she didn't take that car to John's house. She drove it to Jen McCabe's, and then Jen McCabe drove her back to John's where Carrie met them, and then they all rode together in Carrie's car to go look for John. That's when they found him. So her car didn't go back over to 34 Fairview. How is the first time that we're hearing the term missing pieces in reference to the taillight on a statement of case and not on any of the statements from any of the law enforcement or responders or witnesses. Nobody. It's from Lally. When the ladies went to go look for John, according to the January 29th report for Jen McCabe's interview, she says that the first place they went to look was 34 Fairview. Now, Jen says that they go here because this is the last place that Karen thinks that she'll find John. But it brings more questions to me. Jen McCabe had just left that house at 1:47 a.m. There were other people who had left that house. If none of them saw John in the yard, why is that the first place that they went back to? Reports also show that Carrie and Jen apparently did not see John right away, but they said that Karen did. She panicked and she asked for them to stop the car immediately. She jumped out and ran right over to him. It's about 6 a.m. when they find John's body. Reports say that he had about 6 inches of snow on him, and one report said that he was covered in snow. Carrie began to wipe snow off of him, and Carrie and Karen began to do CPR. All of the reports say that Karen ran over and threw her body on top of him to try to warm him up. Now, the statement of case, the PCA, and the February 1st interview all say that Jen said that Karen threw herself on him for warmth. But remember that January 29th interview, the one that wasn't actually filed until April? Well, they added to the story. On that report, it says that Karen laid on him for warmth and then stated, quote, "Oh my God, did I hit him?" End quote. This is a huge, huge deal. Why would this be the only report where she said that? It seems like every report, as they're being filed, it just keeps growing and growing. According to the February 1st interview report, Jen said that he was lying on his back and his phone was on the ground underneath him. How did she know that? If he's lying on the ground, how would you know that his phone is underneath him? According to the statement of case, it's at this point when Karen yelled to Jen twice to Google, "How long do you have to be left outside to die from hypothermia?" But according to the February 1st interview, Jen McCabe said that Karen was yelling and screaming one minute and completely calm the next. Jen said that they prayed Our Father together, and then Karen immediately yelled at Jen 2 times to Google, "How long do you have to be left outside to die from hypothermia?" I know it sounds like a small discrepancy, but it's 2 different scenarios. There's also another mistake in this report because in this report, they asked Jen what Karen and John were like while they were at the, quote, water club. That's another mistake because, of course, it's waterfall, not water club. How are there so many mistakes on these documents? Now, something else that's not documented in any of the reports previous to this, but is on the statement of case, they say that Carrie observed grass underneath John's back, that it was not covered in snow as the remainder of the area was. Okay, this is also a huge deal because not only is this not anywhere, it just all of a sudden appears on the statement of case, but that would mean that he had been out there since before the snow was falling, which we know is not the case. According to the PCA, Katie McLaughlin also said that when she arrived, John was being worked on by paramedics. Once inside the ambulance, she observed him to have trauma to the face and eye area and vomit in his mouth. Now, the vomit in his mouth was something that I thought was kind of interesting just because we have heard from multiple statements that they were giving him mouth-to-mouth and giving him CPR, so it's just something to note. It's at this point in the report where Katie says that she asked Karen if she knew where the victim suffered trauma. And according to the report, Karen turned to her friend and said, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." Sergeant Lank was contacted at 6:08 a.m., and he arrived on the scene at 6:24 a.m. State Police, Trooper Proctor, was contacted at 6:38 a.m., and he called back within a few minutes and was made aware of the situation. As all of this is happening, Nicole and Brian Albert both are still in the house and have not come out. Now keep in mind, Brian is a Boston police officer, and there's another Boston police officer dead on his lawn. And he's not coming out not even to see what happens, but he's even trained as a first responder, and he doesn't come out. Nicole says in a statement that it was later on during morning hours when she was still in bed and her sister Jen McCabe came in and shared with her what had transpired. She says that John was found dead on the edge of the property, and Nicole said that she had never left her home. And by the time that she came downstairs, Canton Fire Department must have transported John and Karen from the scene. Brian and Nicole both say that they didn't hear or see anything until they were woken up by Jen McCabe. There are multiple reports of Karen being hysterical while she was on the scene. It's around 9 a.m. when Jen McCabe calls Sergeant Lank and asks him to come back to the house to speak to her. They go immediately, and she tells them that she remembered something that she wasn't sure if they were aware of. This is the whole thing about how Karen allegedly said, "I hope I didn't hit him." I have to wonder, just to look at every theory, let's say this is a conspiracy to frame Karen to take the heat for something that happened in that house that was possibly an accident or something that just went too far. The first time it's actually documented that there was any kind of mention of Karen saying, "I hope I didn't hit him," was this moment. Because if you look at it, the timeline that we've just gone down, some of those statements that were made about what she said and her saying that during those times, those statements and those reports weren't filed until later. This is the actual first time when this is mentioned. And if I were a conspiracy theorist, I would take note of that. Let's look at it like this. After the police have gone, and now the family is sitting there talking about what just happened and trying to plan out what's going to happen, what if this is what they came up with? Could this be the start of a conspiracy? On the next episode, we're going to get into the details of the two searches. Why was the first search done so thoroughly that they were able to find pieces of clear broken cocktail glass in the yard around John, but somehow they missed large pieces of red plastic taillight and a shoe? Also, we'll dig into the discrepancies in time and reports when it comes to Karen's car. Was Proctor alone with her car for a full hour before that second search was done when they suddenly found taillight? And why did the police report change? All that and more on the next episode of Conspiracy in Canton, the controversial case of Karen Reed.